Welcome everybody to episode 9 of our French Revolution series. We are approaching almost to the end of our series because we have 14 episodes. We're already at episode 9. Before the guillotine fell, before the world would know her as a symbol of royal downfall, Marie Antoinette had already been condemned, not by a court, but by the people of France. In this episode, we explore the deep roots of the hatred directed at the Queen and how her image became a scapegoat for France's economic collapse, and why, even as Austrian blood flowed through her veins, no army came to save her. From royal scandals to the blood-soaked fields of the Vendée, this is the story of how Marie Antoinette's downfall was intertwined with a nation at war, both within and beyond its borders. So far, we know that the roots of the French Revolution were many, but the deepest were economic. It was the crushing financial crisis that finally gave the people, so long removed from the world of kings, ministers, and palaces, a face to blame. That face was the Queen Marie Antoinette. She became the perfect symbol of excess, a queen isolated in luxury while an entire nation sank deeper into poverty. Yet, despite her reputation of extravagance, the truth is more complex. Marie Antoinette's personal spending, while certainly lavish, had only a minor effect on the state's enormous financial problems. As is still true today, cutting political expenses is often a popular demand, but it rarely solves the real crisis. In the shadow of public debt, the cost of court life, or even a queen's personal luxuries, it was just a drop in an ocean. But politics has never been just about numbers, whether in the 18th centuries or today. It's just about perception, emotion, and symbolism. And from the people's perspective, Marie Antoinette had become the living symbol of everything that was wrong with the old order. When people were starving, they thought of their queen living in luxury, hosting endless parties and banquets. That was more than they could tolerate. And that reaction was only natural, because even in the age of absolute monarchy, rulers could not survive without public approval. Power was never just about law or divine right. It also rested on belief. For a monarchy to endure, the people had to see the king and queen as worthy. They had to believe their rulers acted as intermediaries between themselves and God. When that belief was broken, the monarchy's foundations began to crumble. But Marie Antoinette wasn't just resented for her wealth. She carried another burden. She was a foreigner, an Austrian princess married into the French crown. Under the Ancien regime, queens were almost always outsiders. Kings were expected to marry someone of equal royal blood, and that meant foreign princesses. For centuries, this had fueled suspicion and distrust, especially in times of hardship. Even Italian noble women, like the Medici, who became queens of France, often faced deep resentment and mistrust at court. Women like Caterina de' Medici and Maria de' Medici both faced xenophobia, political suspicion, and public hostility, partly because they were seen as outsiders and partly due to their strong political influence. And now it was Marie Antoinette's turn. Her husband, Louis XVI, had once been loved by the people, but she never enjoyed that same affection. Worse still, as the revolution gathered momentum, suspicion only deepened around the Queen. Many believed it wasn't Louis XVI making decisions at all. Behind the scenes, it was said, Marie Antoinette and her aristocratic allies were the real force urging him to resist the will of the people. When the revolution first erupted, Louis reluctantly accepted the new political order, but even then, he clung tightly to the last weapon in his royal arsenal, the power of veto. Under the new constitutional monarchy, the king still had the right to block laws passed by the National Assembly, and each time he used that power, the people's anger swelled. It wasn't long before the revolutionaries gave him the nickname Monsieur Veto, a mocking label that perfectly captured their growing frustration with a king who, in their eyes, stood in the way of progress. And Marie Antoinette, too, was not spared. She was branded Madame Veto, immortalized in revolutionary pamphlets, propaganda, and even in the street songs of Paris. One of the most famous was La Carmagnole, written and sung by the sans-culottes, the radical working-class revolutionaries. The title refers to the Carmagnole, a jacket worn by revolutionaries, which became a symbol of anti-royalist defiance. The lyrics mocked the king, Monsieur Veto, and the queen, Madame Veto, but it was more broadly aimed at the monarchy and aristocracy as a defiant tune that openly accused the queen of treachery. The lyrics were chilling. Madame Veto avait promis de faire égorger tout Paris. Pardon my French. Madame Veto had promised to have all Paris slaughtered. In the eyes of the revolutionaries, she was no longer just an out-of-touch queen. She had become the villain of the revolution's story. The embodiment of royal betrayal for Marie Antoinette, as we all know, her story ended in tragedy. But there's a question that still puzzles many. Why didn't Austria, her homeland, the empire ruled by her own family, step in to save her? After all, she wasn't just any queen. She was an Austrian archduchess, the daughter of Empress Maria Theresa, and one of Europe's most powerful monarchs. By the time Marie Antoinette stood trial, Austria, her homeland, had long been at war with revolutionary France. Any chance of saving her through diplomacy had vanished. When the guillotine claimed her on October 16, 1793, Austrian and French forces were already locked in battle along the border near the Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium. And France wasn't fighting Austria alone. Nearly all of Europe had turned against the revolution. To the south, the strategic port city of Toulon had been seized by royalist rebels, who had called in British and Spanish fleets to occupy it. Retaking the city would take months. But when Republican forces finally succeeded, it was due to the brilliance of a young, then unknown artillery officers, the one that we know, Napoleon Bonaparte. Meanwhile, in Western France, civil war was raging, the Vendée uprising, a royalist revolt fueled by Catholic and monarchist forces, was ravaging the countryside. As Marie Antoinette met her fate in Paris, Republican forces under General Kléber dealt a decisive blow to the Vendée rebels at the Battle of Cholet. By this point, the Queen was a prisoner in a country at war with her native Austria, and any hope of rescue had long since faded. The revolution was fighting for its survival on every front. The Battle of Cholet was a turning point in the brutal civil war, as the war in the Vendée, a royalist counter-revolutionary uprising that had erupted in western France. This wasn't part of France's fight against foreign monarchy. It was a war tearing the nation apart from within. In the Vendée, a deeply rural and fiercely Catholic region, the people had risen in open rebellion against the radical new republic. The breaking point had come with two devastating blows: the execution of Louis XVI in January 1793 and the Republic's decree of levée en masse, a policy of mass conscription forcing ordinary citizens into military service for the Revolutionary Army. For many in the Vendée, this was too much to bear. They didn't want to fight for the Republic. They wanted to fight for the king, rallying around a handful of charismatic leaders, including Charles de Bonchamp and Maurice d'Albret. The rebels formed what became known as the Catholic and Royal Army. At its peak, the force swelled to nearly 40,000 men, though most were not seasoned soldiers. Armed with old muskets, farming tools, pitchforks, and scythes, they were peasants turned royalist warriors marching against the revolution in defense of faith and monarchy. On October 17, 1793, the royalist forces of the Catholic and Royal Army faced off against the Republican army near the town of Cholet, a critical stronghold in the Vendée. The Republican army, commanded by General Jean-Baptiste Kléber, fielded between 26,000 and 30,000 men. Among them were the seasoned Mayennais, veterans from the garrisons at Mainz. giving the Republicans a disciplined and battle-hardened corps. The Royalist forces, numbering around 35 to 40,000, held the advantage in sheer size, but most were poorly trained and lacked formal organization. As the Republican columns advanced, the Royalists pulled back to defensive positions along the Moine River, determined to make a stand. But the Republicans held the real advantage: better artillery, tighter discipline, and greater battlefield experience. The assault was brutal. As the fighting raged, the Royalist line began to crumble under the pressure, but their commander, Maurice d'Albret, was struck by multiple gunshots and left for dead. Panic rippled through the Vendéan ranks. With their leadership shattered, the center collapsed. The Royalist fighters broke and fled, retreating across the Loire River as Republican cavalry pressed the pursuit. The cost of the battle was devastating. Estimates suggest that between 8,000 and 12,000 Royalists were killed or wounded, and many more were captured and executed in the aftermath. The Republicans paid a heavy price as well, losing between 4,000 and 6,000 men, but their victory was decisive. The defeat at Cholet shattered the cohesion of the Vendéan army, and from this point forward, Royalist resistance would never again pose the same threat. With Cholet's fall, the Republic was able to unleash its most ruthless response, the infamous Infernal Columns, a brutal scorched earth campaign that would leave much of the Vendée in ruins. For Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the Battle of Cholet came too late. Their fates had already been sealed. Marie Antoinette was executed on October 16, 1793, just one day before the battle, yet the war in the Vendée was a direct consequence of the monarchy's collapse and the deep loyalty it continued to inspire in parts of France. Well, as the revolution spiraled into open civil war, it was no longer enough for France to unseat a king. It had to reshape the entire social order. Marie Antoinette's execution was just one act in a much larger tragedy, and the Battle of Cholet marked the point of no return. The Republic would crush its enemies at home in the same ruthlessness it showed on the battlefield. But the question remains, was the monarchy's fall inevitable, or was it pushed over the edge by fear, propaganda, and betrayal? I assume it was all three of those things, because there was the assumption that by declaring war to Austria, the king was playing the double game. He was hoping to be invaded, so the foreign armies would swipe in through France and get rid of the Republicans, the revolutionaries, and help clear out the field from the monarchy. Because you also have to know that many nobles that were able, they all escaped into other countries. And the only thing that comes to mind is that the revolution shook truly the foundation of Europe, because most places, most countries in Europe enjoyed the monarchy. So you have to imagine that these places, all these nobles throughout Europe were afraid and scared that the same thing was going to happen in their own country. So Louis XVI's hope was to be conquered by foreign nations in order to get rid of the revolutionaries and reestablish the monarchy. Well, this was an episode that was full of information and events, and I hope it leaves you thinking about the nature of the revolution. As you can see, is transforming, is mutating into something else, into something bigger. And we'll see more about this in the following episodes. Thank you very much for following up so far, and if you're sticking too long, if you're here for so long, I commend you once again, and I will see you next time. Bye.